delighted to have the opportunity to be interviewing Molotkov on his, I would say, section, or we'll discuss that, from his memoir. This particular story lives on its own and is entitled Miscommunication.
Thank you, Will.
Let's start with the title. I believe that the parenthesis in miscommunication, which is around the miss, has great significance in this piece. I know it alludes to the limitations of conversing in a language that is not one's mother tongue, but is also much larger. Would you please elaborate? This is especially central to the fact that you chose not to become a writer writing in Russian, but in English.
Thank you, Willow. And just to catch everyone up, this piece is about a time in my life about 30 years ago when I worked at a deli in Albany, New York, and it describes my process of introducing myself into the American culture. I think that it's very accurately pointed out by you that the miss part was very much a process of learning how to communicate in the new culture. Coming in as a young guy, 22, and having lived in the USSR for all my life, which is a very closed culture under a totalitarian regime. So very much experimenting with what goes, what doesn't go in a social interaction.
Absolutely. Although this is a memoir, you are still a character. How is this writing different, or perhaps more difficult than your fiction?
It's much more difficult in the sense that I don't get to change the plot. I cannot enhance it with something that would make it stronger, which would make the characters' motives more transparent or have them make more sense. It's really the limited set of circumstances I have to work with. Some of them are not as dramatic as they might have been. They're not as interesting as I would love them to be. So it's a way of finding a story in this huge block of time that is my life, and trying to find the parts that align themselves into something that the reader might resonate with.
Please discuss how language defines intimacy for the protagonist in relationship to those who are native Russian speakers and those non-Russians the speaker comes in contact with in Albany, particularly in relationship to women. What made it hard for the narrator to discern when people were being serious and when they were joking?
Coming from an entirely different culture that's based on totally different premises, one of the things that is hardest to gauge is the sense of humor, the play that's involved in any interaction, especially if it's a kind of semi-romantic interaction. You always have an element of play, and that's what often eludes one when they're in a culture they're not familiar with, in a language that's not their first language, that they're still learning the nuance. And so it's finding the nuance that defines a lot of the new immigrant experience. I don't know if I missed any part of your question.
I guess the only part that I think that what really struck me was how important language, fluency, and intimacy is connected, and the difference between the interactions with Russian speakers and with non-Russian speakers. So I was hoping you might elaborate on that, how that functions in the story.
It's a little complicated because coming from a background of the Soviet Union, I have various notions associated with the Russian language, some of which are positive and others are not at all positive. They have to do with the propaganda we had to hear, the coined phrases that were fed us like in any totalitarian regime. And so, in a way, Russian language has become one that I've become ambivalent about, in a way that Paul Celan would become about German in his own life. For way stronger reasons in his case, but the language alienates you when the culture is built on a lie. So the English language, I embraced it right away as being more honest, as belonging to cultures that have a more sincere and more honest life. It's sort of a high stakes game. You want to invest in this new language, but you're still learning it. So that shaky ground was definitely part of my experience, especially as I transitioned to trying to write in English a couple of years after my arrival.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that really helped me to understand more deeply some of my ponderings. It is fascinating how the protagonist struggles with issues of identity and class, how he assumes others see him as a relatively new immigrant and his own self-concept. How is his immigrant experience different than a new immigrant today, would you say?
Than a new immigrant right now in 2020?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I can give a really well-educated answer because I haven't really followed up on the immigration situation right now, but I would say it's much more difficult to be an immigrant these days because of the very adversarial stance that the Trump administration has taken on it. So right now it's going to be much more difficult to be an immigrant. I don't know if there are any essential differences though in terms of a person uprooted from their own culture coming to a new one. I would say another difference that works maybe in favor of the contemporary immigrants is the ability to access information. When I came to the United States in 1990, I really knew barely anything about the country. Just things we could glimpse from the films that sometimes made their way through into the Russian theaters, but certainly most contemporary literature was not available to us. You could get in trouble for reading an American newspaper, so we didn't really know what the American life was to a greater degree maybe than is possible nowadays. So a lot of it was totally just new territory.
And I thought what you also did is explore class, I felt, in a pretty subtle way, because you came from a background of education, then you were working in a deli, so there was a lot of assumptions as a new immigrant that may not have been how you actually saw yourself, but how you imagined Americans might have seen you. Is that accurate?
It's a little bit accurate, and it's a little bit of a construct because in a sense I came to the States with a sense of not having a firm identity. I was going to make an identity around the core that I knew was going to stay, that I was going to keep being a writer and trying to be a moral person. But outside of that, so many parameters were up in play, and so it was really kind of finding my new personality and building it upon the premises that I could believe in. So I didn't really have such great expectations. I had 3 years of math and physics at Leningrad State, but I didn't want to continue that. Had I continued, I could have gotten my college degree and moved on into a sort of more educated space in terms of professional work. But I was more interested in just making a living and being a writer. So in that sense, I didn't really have that expectation just that I should be taken as some kind of important entity. I was just assuming I was just a guy from somewhere. Nobody should care about me.
I think that's fascinating. It's obviously the person that I know now has a strong sense of identity. And my last question is, this protagonist is neither aloof nor taciturn, like many Russian stereotypes. The narrator juggles with the complex issue of not being seen as an individual, but as a representative of Russia, with a variety of emotions connected to that. Please explain the process of moving from insight to getting it down on the page.
This is a very difficult process, and especially when you're trying to recover those experiences half your life later. I think that's a challenge of memoir work. I'm debating how to talk about it briefly. I think you find the experiences that seem to transcend the individual, the personal, where you feel like somebody else might relate to that, and you try to recapture your feeling at the time, but also sort of present a filter of your more adult, more recent opinion to give an idea of how much your experience now is different and how much your opinion maybe has changed about it. So it's a little bit of a juggling. Too much current voice could be a problem, too much of the past voice could be a problem. I don't know if there is any good formula for this, but you just try to build it in a way that people could get what you're talking about and relate to it in some way.
Well, I really want to thank you, and I think what you also expressed is finding the universal in the individual. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you about miscommunication this afternoon. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you so much, Will.